It's always heartbreaking to hear about murder cases turning cold as years go on without any leads. But every so often, a case that everyone is sure will stay cold forever has a breakthrough. It could be months or even years down the road. Would you least expect it? The following stories tell the tale of 3 teen cold cases that were solved due to brutal plot twists. We have a bright teenager who went out for a night of partying that went terribly wrong, a junior high student who she vanished out of thin air, and a group of 3 young boys who took a bike ride to a local store to pick up a movie. Only 2 of these 3 boys would ever return home alive.
A bombshell revelation in a Newaygo County cold case. The murder of Shannon Sider, one of the key witnesses against the brothers convicted in her murder, recanted his testimony.
Yeah, saying he lied on the stand. And not only that, he claims he had never even seen the brothers outside of a courtroom and that law enforcement fed him information before the trial.
It was the year 1989, and single father Bob Siders was living in a town in western Michigan with his 18-year-old daughter Shannon, his only child. The date is July 17th, and Bob says goodnight to Shannon before he leaves to work the night shift at a local factory. That night, Shannon would go out partying with a group of friends. When Bob returned home the following morning, he checked the house, but his daughter wasn't there. Bob recalled that fateful day and what his daughter had been like growing up.
My daughter, she was a typical young child growing up, inquisitive. When she was younger, my wife decided she didn't want to stay married anymore, so we ended up getting divorced and I got custody. So I ended up raising Shannon.
As soon as Bob came to realize that his daughter wasn't just gone, she was missing, he went into action immediately and did everything possible to bring her home. He implored the community to help and provide him with any information they may have about his daughter's whereabouts.
I had missing person flyers printed up and sent copies of the flyers to every police post in the state.
Labor Day weekend comes around, and Bob's confidence that Shannon will be found alive is beginning to wane. That weekend, 2 people were hiking through a dense area of the woods that was off the beaten path. They happened to notice 2 small items on the ground. They turn out to be forms of identification with Shannon's name on them.
The area where these things were found, they called it the Hole in the Woods. It was a well-known party spot for local kids.
Bob Siders knew all about the Hole in the Woods. In fact, he used to visit this spot back when he was a teenager, but he had no idea that it was a place where his daughter would hang out with her friends. Now, with a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach, Bob decided to go to the hole and do some investigating of his own.
And I, at that point, was fearing the worst. I was looking for either a body or a grave.
Unfortunately, Bob wouldn't find anything during his search. Eventually, October rolled around, and it had been 3 months since Shannon had disappeared. Police still had no leads. There would soon be a breakthrough in the case, but it's not the outcome that anyone was hoping for. A hunter had been traveling through the woods looking for deer when all of a sudden he made a very disturbing discovery. It was a body that was partially decayed. He immediately left the woods and went directly to the state police to report it. Not long after, Bob Siders would get the worst phone call of his life.
We got a phone call about 10 o'clock, and my girlfriend at the time, Linda, answered the phone. And I had trouble with this part. So she gave me the phone. And she said, Bob, they found the body up here and they think it's Shannon. And the police are looking for you. I said, okay.
Bob immediately goes to speak with the detectives that inform him that he had actually been looking for his daughter in the right area of the woods. Had he gone even just a little bit further, he would have likely been the one to stumble upon her body. Shannon was no longer missing, but there were still so many questions remaining. Who had done this to her, and why? Shannon's body was taken in to be examined, and it's clear that she had been injured in multiple ways and in multiple places before her death.
She was brutally beaten, and ultimately the cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head.
It wasn't only that, but it appears that Shannon had been taken advantage of sexually prior to her death. There was also some disturbing mutilation visible on her body. This mutilation may have been done in some sort of sick attempt to cover up the evidence. Police began to look into people that Shannon might have been with that night.
The profiler unit in Lansing believed that Shannon was likely killed by someone within her peer group and her age group, by more than one perpetrator, and there was a good chance that alcohol and drugs were a factor, and also that she was likely killed by someone that she knew.
Police also believed that with much certainty, Shannon's killer was not a stranger, but rather someone she knew. In the case of a lot of murders, the killer will take something off the body as a sort of token or souvenir. This could be clothing or a piece of jewelry. Investigators were made aware of a class ring that Shannon wore pretty much all the time. The ring was missing from her finger when her body was found, and it was not found anywhere inside of her home. Had one of her former friends stolen it off of her after killing her? This was something investigators made a note of.
Investigators were looking for the one person that was last with Shannon. And it turns out there were 8 people that last saw Shannon alive. The investigators talked to all 8 of these kids in detail at police stations, on recording for those willing, taking polygraphs, and tried to rule them out one by one.
Throughout these interviews, investigators are able to get an estimated timeline of the events that happened on the night of Shannon's disappearance. They would soon learn that the real focus of the group of kids Shannon was with that night was to simply get drunk and have a good time. When interviewing some of Shannon's other friends that weren't in attendance, they would also find out that this was not a group of people that she would hang out with often, and that they weren't necessarily close. A few of the kids at the party tell police that Shannon got into a car with Paul and Matt Jones.
Paul and Matt Jones were brothers that grew up south of Newaygo. The original plan was that they were going to go back to Shannon's house and watch movies and drink beer.
So the 2 brothers and Shannon ended up breaking off from the rest of the group. The brothers would later tell police that they dropped Shannon off at home and then left sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. At first, their story seems to add up. They were able to provide a detailed description not only of what Shannon's house looked like, but what lights were on inside.
They saw Shannon's dog moving around inside of the house.
You could see the TV through one of the windows, and that there was a porch light. It led the investigators to believe that what they were saying was truthful.
Paul and Matt took a polygraph test, which they both passed, and it seemed as if they appeared pretty innocent. One by one, police worked their way through the group of people that had been partying that night, but nobody could provide any details about what may have happened that night. Shannon's friend Julia recalled how many people in town didn't want to believe that one of Shannon's own friends could have done this to her.
People wanted to think that it was a stranger. That would have been the easiest. But the fact that she was found in such a remote spot that was known to local people made that hard to stay with.
When Julia first discovered that Shannon hadn't come home on the night that she disappeared, she immediately stopped by her house. She had a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach.
I got off of work at 10, and then I started looking for Shannon. The first time I went over there, it would have been about 11:30, 11:45, and she wasn't home. About every half hour, I would go over again, knocking on the door. I even went in at one point, ran up to her room, and she wasn't there.
With little to go on, the police implored the other kids of the community to come forward if they knew anything. That's when Lindsay Bradley, one of Shannon's good friends, decided to speak up. Lindsay had formerly dated Paul Jones, and on the night of Shannon's disappearance, she had been riding around in his car with him. When she was in the car, she noticed something strange. It was a female's class ring in the ashtray of his vehicle.
She confronted him and said, "You're asking me on a date when you have another girl's class ring." And then he said, "Let's face it, she's probably dead."
What a horrible and strange thing to say. Who would want to incriminate themselves in this way? As soon as the investigators learned of this bombshell revelation, they began to think the Jones brothers could have really been behind the murder after all.
That said to me that maybe that was Shannon's class ring. and that Paul and Matt Jones killed her. We believe there was some attempt at sexual advances and Shannon resisted, and they didn't want to take no for an answer.
Still, police didn't have direct evidence to convict Paul and Matt. They needed more information. This would mean that the case would sadly become cold for many years. Shannon's friends and family members were left wondering if justice would ever be served for this young woman. Police knew that there was likely someone out there who knew more information about the night of Shannon's murder than they let on. They just needed to get over their fears and come forward. Finally, someone would, but not until 2014, many years after Shannon's death. The person that came forward was Jenny Corrigan. Jenny was just 14 years old the night of Shannon's death.
Jenny told us she may have seen something relevant to what happened to Shannon that night. On the night that Shannon disappeared, Jenny Corrigan had not been with Shannon and the group of 8 kids. She was riding around with Dean Robinson. They came across a car that was parked. Dean ended up having a conversation with the driver of this other vehicle while Jenny stayed in the car. Jenny heard the person identify themselves as Jones. She overheard the driver say that they were looking for a girl.
This definitely could suggest that the Jones brothers were looking for Shannon that night. It was possible that she had already escaped them once and they were trying to capture her again. Dean and the Jones brothers would then part ways, but the Jones brothers did not go home after that. Instead, they continued to search for Shannon.
Eventually, Paul and Matt Jones were able to find Shannon.
They caught up to her. They beat her back.
It's believed that the last minutes of Shannon's life were true torture, as the Jones brothers took turns violently assaulting her and taking advantage of her for their own pleasure. They beat her to the point of crushing her skull and to the point that they knew they would be taking her life. That night, Dean and Jenny were still riding around in the car, and they happened to come across the Joneses' vehicle again.
Later, Dean and Jenny came back through, and they see the same 2 brothers standing outside of the car with a girl laying unconscious or lifeless on the ground. Dean got out, started to run up to see if he could help, and tripped and fell. Dean recognized that it was Shannon Siders. And that's when he described Paul Jones coming over and kicking him in the face.
While Dean laid on the ground trying to protect himself from Paul's violent blows, Matt came around the side of the vehicle with a hammer, perhaps to finish the job for his brother. But it wasn't until then that the Jones brothers realized Jenny was in the car. As soon as they saw that they were a witness, they both took off. This is the story as Dean Robinson told the police at the time.
After Dean's statement, there's no denying that Paul and Matt Jones killed Shannon Siders.
Matt and Paul Jones, finally, after over 20 years, justice could finally be served for poor Shannon, and her family could finally have some sort of peace. At least, so it seemed at the time. In July of 2015, Matthew and Paul Jones were to be sentenced for Shannon Siders' murder.
The 2 brothers involved in the 1989 murder of Shannon Siders learned their fates today in an Owego County courtroom. And tonight, Siders' loved ones say this is the justice that they've been looking for.
The Jones brothers' sentences were severe, but seemed fair to all.
Matthew Jones and his brother Paul went before a judge on this case for what will likely be the last time this afternoon. Paul Jones was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to between 30 and 70 years in prison. Matthew Jones was convicted of first-degree murder and will serve the mandatory life sentence on that case. The evidence against the brothers was convincing. They were the last to see Shannon Siders, and there were witnesses who claimed to see the men standing over her body in the woods. Siders' loved ones have been waiting for so long for this case since it all happened back in 1989, and today they say they got the justice they've been looking for.
Shannon's family was overjoyed that justice was finally served.
She's free now. Her spirit is free with her ancestors, and I believe she's happy now.
And so just like that, it appeared that the case had been neatly wrapped up and closed. Or so everyone thought. Nobody could have expected that years later, in 2021, Dean Robinson would end up changing his story. Dean was in prison for assault charges that were unrelated to this case when he ended up changing his story completely. He said that what he had testified against Paul and Matt was false, and that he just said what investigators told him to say. He had lied about it all. So what does this mean? Could Paul and Matt have been innocent this whole time after all?
That this was more than a mistake. It is a wrongful conviction, that it should not be. The Jones brothers did not have anything to do with the death of Shannon Siders.
Bill Proctor is a private investigator who looked carefully at the details of this case. In this reporter's opinion, police were simply looking for someone to pin the murder on so that the community would stop asking questions. Could Paul and Matt have just been scapegoats in this situation?
There's nothing forensic, nothing physical to tie the Jones brothers to the death of Shannon Siders. It was not presented in court.
Bill Proctor believes that the Jones brothers dropped Shannon off at home after a night of partying and left, and that someone else did something to Shannon afterward. The fact that Dean Robinson had recanted his earlier statements against the Jones brothers suggests that Bill might be correct in his assessment.
I was lying under oath when I testified about any matter involving Matt or Paul Jones being involved in a homicide.
Bill Proctor pointed out that Dean isn't exactly the most ideal witness. Not only does he have a serious criminal history, but he has been caught lying on the stand before. Could the police really believe anything he had to say at this point? It would seem that this one man's testimony, now that it's been recanted, is not enough to actually convict the two men of murder. But that's not all. Bill says there are other elements of evidence related to the case that would suggest that someone was to blame for Shannon's murder, and it wasn't the Jones brothers.
She had hair clutched in her hands. The hair tested against the Jones brothers, no match. The police being able to put their hands on and actually take into custody the Jones brothers' car showed no evidence of any violence inside that car. No evidence that any criminal activity took place there. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle.
Bill wants the community to know that they should not feel comfortable that Shannon's killer is behind bars. In fact, he believes that the true killer is still living free, possibly capable of killing again. As of now, in 2022, the Jones brothers remain behind bars, but they have asked for their case to be reviewed. What do you think? Do you agree with Bill Proctor that the Jones brothers are innocent? Let us know in the comments.
This just in, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office has solved a 43-year-old homicide cold case of a young girl.
Yeah, investigators say that it was September 7th, 1979, when 12-year-old Leisha Jackson disappeared from her neighborhood off of FM 1485.
It's hard to imagine how the family of a murder victim could continue to go about their daily lives for years without knowing what happened to their loved one. Sadly, some people have no choice. That was unfortunately the case of the Jackson family for a long time. It took 43 years to solve the case of young Leisha Michelle Jackson, one of the oldest known cold cases to actually end up solved. It's also one of the oldest and most famous murder cases in Texas, particularly in Montgomery County. It's due to modern improvements and new forensic tools that were not available back in the 70s that finally brought about answers in this case. This case took place back in 1979 in the town of Conroe, Texas. It's a family-friendly hometown with some pretty interesting history. In fact, the one and only Bonnie and Clyde actually spent some time hiding out in this town years ago. Conroe is also home to a lot of popular fishing and swimming spots, which young Lesia and her brothers enjoyed. Lesia was a kind and well-mannered junior high student who got along well with everyone. In the fall of 1979, she and a group of younger family members went to visit a local lake for a swim. But by the time her cousins and brothers were ready to leave, she decided to stay for just a few minutes longer, and they left without her. When her mother came back later to check on her, Lesia was nowhere in sight. Her family became very concerned and immediately reported Lesia missing to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. The police started their investigation right away by talking to children who had also been at the lake that day. One boy was able to point out something of interest. He saw a brown Monte Carlo driving down the street erratically, so much so that he and others had to jump out of the way to avoid being hit. Investigators' first suspicion is that Lesia may have been kidnapped by the person in that vehicle, but they can find no trace of that car in town. In order to rule out a possible accidental drowning, they had the lake swept for bodies, but nothing turned up. Search parties would then go on to search local wooded areas. While they didn't find a body, they did find an important piece of evidence. It was a pair of horn-rimmed glasses, just like the pair Lesia wore every day. It would soon be determined that these were in fact her glasses. At this point, Lesia's family was already fearing the worst, and unfortunately, their suspicions would be correct. Just 6 days later, a man was in an area not far from the lake where Lesia went missing from. He was on duty preparing to fix a power line when all of a sudden he smelled something terrible. He first thought it was a dead animal, but when he got closer, he realized it was the body of a young girl. Unfortunately, the jewelry and clothing on the body would match the description of what poor Lesia had been wearing on the day she went missing. The little girl had been horribly assaulted and taken advantage of before being strangled to death. Evidence of her violent death was clear through samples found on her beautiful silver and gold butterfly necklace, which was still hanging around her neck. Lesia Jackson's body was laid to rest, while police continued to search the town for the monster that did this to her. They interviewed numerous suspects before eventually coming across a Vietnam veteran who offered up a written confession in which he claimed to be the person that killed the little girl. This individual was already in prison at the time for an unrelated offense. Unfortunately, investigators would later determine that he was just making the whole thing up, likely in an attempt to get out of jail early. He was sadly not Lesia's true killer. Due to no more available information about the crime, this case would soon become known. That is, until years later in 2006. One of Lesia's old classmates, named Tommy DeRoy, would end up entering the police force and getting assigned to this cold case. Even though Tommy hadn't been that close to Lesia when she was still alive, he was still determined to bring her family some answers. Tommy was interested in using new forms of DNA testing to try to figure out who Lesia's killer could be. This includes a modern method known as vacuum sampling. The fact that this case was being reopened all these years later, Lesia's family had already made peace with things that were very difficult for them. But ultimately, it was what helped provide them with answers to all of these many years later. In October of 2021, DNA extracted from Lesia's shirt was used to successfully find her killer. His name was Gerald Dwight Casey. Gerald was no longer alive at the time of this realization. He was a convicted killer who had been executed by lethal injection in April of 2022 for an unrelated murder case. At that time, he became only the 770th killer in the United States to be executed this way. He was truly a violent killer with a long criminal history. He was known not only for assaults against police officers, but also drug sales. He never showed any remorse for his actions, even all the way up until his execution. His last meal would end up being fried chicken and a Dr. Pepper before he was wiped off this world forever. Even though Casey might have gotten away at the time of his death by killing poor Lesia, he was luckily brought to justice for his slaying of an additional woman. This might have felt like such a bittersweet ending to Lesia's friends and family that had waited for so long for some sort of answer. The good news was that Lesia's killer was dead, and he'll never have an opportunity to hurt another innocent person again. But the bad news was that he would never be forced to answer for her horrific death. He would never provide details regarding exactly what he did to young Lesia or why he did what he did. Her remaining family members must come to peace with the fact that they will never have any kind of closure that they were looking for. May Lesia rest in peace, and may her bright light and sweet soul be remembered forever.
And now to a chilling confession in a Minnesota courtroom to a murder mystery that has haunted that state for nearly 3 decades. A man finally admitting to the 1989 abduction, assault, and killing of an 11-year-old boy.
It was the evening of Sunday, October 2nd of 1989. An 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, his younger brother, and a friend had gone to a local store to pick up a video and were riding their bikes back home when a disturbing tragedy struck. A figure wearing a stocking cap and holding a revolver forced the boys off their bikes and into a ditch. He then made each of them lie on the ground, threatening them all with his gun. The man ended up asking each boy to tell them his age. He ended up picking up Jacob's 10-year-old brother Trevor to let free. He told Trevor to run away as fast as he could and not to look back. If he did, he would be shot. Trevor did as he was instructed.
Told me to run to the woods as fast as I could and then grab Jacob.
There were 2 boys left behind, Jacob and his 11-year-old best friend, Aaron. He would ultimately decide to free Aaron, giving him the same warning he had given Trevor. Aaron would also run away, leaving Jacob alone with the man. Aaron would be the last person, aside from this man, to see Jacob alive. Police were notified of what happened, and news spread very quickly across the state. Missing posters were hung up, and a hefty reward was posted for any information about where Jacob could be. The crime scene was investigated closely for evidence, and investigators looked specifically at tire tracks visible on the ground. They hoped that by looking at the tread in the tire marks, they would be able to locate the vehicle and the suspect who was driving. They would end up questioning a man named Danny Heinrich. They thought him to be so much of a suspect that they even took DNA samples from him. The only problem was that at the time, there was not the science or technology available to connect Danny's DNA with a possible murder. Not to mention, Jacob's remains had not yet been located. And so without anything more to go on, this case would become cold for 27 long years. Even though the years passed, one after another, Jacob's parents never stopped looking for him, and they never gave up hope. They thought that he could still be out there somewhere, grown up, and without a way of getting back home. Unfortunately, that would not be the case. It's not until 2015 when investigators take a second look at Danny Heinrich's DNA sample. They manage to obtain a search warrant and enter Danny's home. They end up finding illegal content on his computer, and this is enough to finally bring him behind bars. When Danny was confronted with the DNA evidence that the police now had the technology to use against him, he would ultimately make the decision to take a plea deal and confess to the murder of Jacob Wetterling.
For 9,827 mornings, this young boy's mother had woken up wondering in agony what had really happened to her son. Today, she no longer has to wonder after that chilling confession in this courthouse.
Danny told the investigators that after kidnapping and handcuffing young Danny, he took advantage of his body, killed him, and buried him in a gravel pit. He managed to avoid arrest for so many years by listening to a police scanner. Danny was able to guide investigators to Jacob's burial spot, finally giving his family some sort of peace. But the pain will never go away. His mother spoke out shortly after the news was announced.
I want to say, Jacob, I'm so sorry. It's incredibly painful to know his last days, last hours, last minutes. We love you, Jacob. We will continue to fight. Our hearts are hurting.
On his day of sentencing, then 53-year-old Danny came before the court and Jacob's family and issued a long overdue apology.
To Mr. and Mrs. Wetterling, the heinous acts of selfishness are unforgivable for what I have taken away from you. I am so sorry.
While Jacob's family now mourns for the loss of a life taken too soon, Jacob's best friend, Aaron, partially blames himself for what happened that day, despite only being 11 years old at the time.
I was the monster. I was the coward that left my best friend.
Because Danny took a plea deal, prosecutors were not allowed to convict him for murder. Instead, they could only charge him for the explicit materials found on his computer of underage children. He was ultimately sentenced to at least 20 years behind bars. While this might not seem like much considering what he did, due to his age, there is a good chance he will die in prison. He is currently 59 years old and remains alive and behind bars.